Right now, there is probably a piece of cheese somewhere in your kitchen. You grabbed it without thinking. You'll eat it without thinking. But the real story of how that cheese ended up in your hands is far stranger than anything printed on the label. It starts with a mistake, not a recipe. A biological mistake that your ancestors turned into one of the most important foods in human history, thousands of years before anyone understood why it worked. To understand it, you have to go back to a problem written into your own body, not a modern one, an ancient one, older than agriculture itself. For almost the entire history of mammals, adults could not drink milk. Not shouldn't, couldn't. Every mammal is built with an enzyme called lactase, which breaks down the natural sugar in milk, called lactose. That enzyme is switched on before birth and stays active through infancy. Then, once weaning ends, it shuts off permanently in most cases. That's not a flaw in the design, that is the design. Milk is baby food. It was never meant to follow you into adulthood. So picture the moment, roughly 10,000 years ago, when small communities across the Fertile Crescent began keeping goats and sheep instead of only hunting them. This region, stretching through parts of what is now Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, is where humans first domesticated many of the animals you still eat and drink from today. For the first time, herds of animals produced milk on a predictable schedule, day after day, season after season. And yet the people standing next to those herds were still built like every other adult mammal on Earth. Their bodies were not equipped to process most of what was suddenly available to them. Goats and sheep were among the very first animals domesticated for this purpose, followed later by cattle a couple of thousand years after that. Once those herds existed, milk stopped being an occasional windfall from a hunted animal and became something closer to a daily surplus, arriving whether anyone was ready for it or not. A single household could suddenly be sitting on more milk than any of its members could drink, let alone digest. Think about how strange that is. You've just tamed an animal that manufactures food constantly, and your own digestive system rejects most of it. What do you do with a resource sitting right in front of you that your body refuses to use? You store it. And storage, it turns out, changed everything. Milk left sitting in a warm container does not stay milk for long. Wild bacteria reach it almost immediately, and they start feeding on the sugars inside it. Something happens in that process that nobody planned and nobody could see happening. The lactose, the exact sugar that adult digestive systems struggle with, starts disappearing, consumed by the very bacteria doing the fermenting. Milk that has fermented for a day already carries less of the sugar that would otherwise cause discomfort. Early herders had no name for this. They just noticed that milk left out for a while behaved differently than fresh milk, and sometimes that difference was worth keeping. But fermentation alone doesn't make cheese. Cheese needed a second accident, and this one involves an object you wouldn't expect, an animal's stomach. Before people had reliable pottery, one of the simplest containers available for carrying liquid was the stomach of a young animal, cleaned out and used like a canteen. Picture an early herder filling one of these pouches with milk for a long day's journey under a hot sun. Inside the lining of that stomach sits a natural enzyme called Rennet, the same substance a nursing calf or lamb produces to digest its mother's milk. Jostled around for hours in the heat, with rennet actively working on it, that milk wouldn't stay liquid. It would separate. Solid curds on one side, watery whey on the other. Nobody engineered that enzyme to make cheese. It was already there, quietly doing its job inside a baby goat's digestive system. Humans simply borrowed it by accident, carrying it around in a container they never suspected would transform what was inside it. Was that first curdled, separated mess something anyone actually wanted to eat? Almost certainly not the first time. But somebody was hungry enough or curious enough or simply unwilling to waste food to try it anyway. And once they did, they had discovered something that would outlast them by thousands of years. Cheese likely wasn't even the first attempt at solving the milk problem. Early herders almost certainly tried other tricks first, churning milk into butter, heating it down into something closer to ghee, letting it sour on purpose and drinking it that way. Some of those methods stuck around for thousands of years in their own right, but none of them solved the storage problem quite like cheese did, and none of them traveled quite as far, or lasted quite as long, once dried and salted. Out of every experiment early humans tried on milk, cheese is the one that left physical evidence behind for archaeologists to actually find. For a long time, this whole account stayed a guess, pieced together from biology, chemistry, and imagination, because guesses were all researchers had. Then in the 1980s, an archaeologist named Peter Bogucki, digging at Neolithic sites in Poland, started uncovering strange fragments of pottery. They weren't ordinary bowls, they were riddled with small, deliberate holes shaped almost exactly like a modern kitchen strainer. Bogucki had a hunch about what these vessels were for, but pottery doesn't come labeled with instructions, and a hunch is not proof. The proof came decades later, and it came from chemistry, not guesswork. A biomolecular archaeologist named Richard Evershed, working at the University of Bristol, developed a method for detecting microscopic traces of fat trapped inside ancient ceramic itself. Fat molecules, it turns out, can survive for thousands of years, sealed into the porous structure of fired clay long after everything else around them has decayed. Using gas chromatography and isotope analysis, techniques that can distinguish the chemical fingerprint of milk fat from the fat of meat or plants, Evershed's team tested those perforated vessels from Poland, dated to roughly 7,000 years old. The chemical signature lit up with milk fat, not meat fat, not plant oil, milk, and specifically the kind of milk fat associated with separating curds from liquid. The holes weren't decoration. They were a strainer. Those ancient bowls had been built to let watery whey drip through while the solid curds stayed trapped inside. In other words, archaeologists had just confirmed some of the oldest cheese-making tools ever found. Stop and sit with what that actually means. 7,000 years before pasteurization, before refrigeration, before anyone had the faintest concept that bacteria even existed, someone had already engineered a working dairy process, refined it enough to build specialized tools for it, and passed that knowledge on. Not with instruments, not with formulas, with trial, failure, and taste. And Poland wasn't an isolated case. Thousands of years later, in a completely different part of the world, cheese turns up again in an even stranger container. In 2018, researchers examining a broken jar inside an ancient Egyptian tomb near Saqqara, the burial place of a mayor named Tamez, found a solid whitish mass that had survived for roughly 3,000 years. A chemist named Enrico Greco led the analysis, running the residue through mass spectrometry to identify its exact composition. The result pointed to a solidified dairy product made from a mixture of sheep or goat milk and cow milk. In plain terms, some of the oldest solid cheese ever found, buried alongside an official of ancient Egypt, sealed in the dark for 3 millennia. 2 continents, thousands of years apart. The same basic idea, discovered again and again wherever humans kept animals that made milk they couldn't fully digest. Here is where the story turns from clever invention into something closer to a workaround for a broken rule of biology. Cheese making strips away much of the lactose in milk before it ever reaches your mouth, partly through fermentation, and partly through the process of separating solid curds from liquid whey, since most of the lactose stays behind in the whey. That meant cheese could deliver something to lactose-intolerant adults that fresh milk never could. Real nutrition without the digestive punishment. For thousands of years, this was essentially the only way most adult humans on the planet could safely get much benefit from dairy at all. Cheese came first. Tolerance came later, much later, and not everywhere. Because somewhere across those same millennia, something else was happening quietly, written directly into human DNA. A genetic mutation appeared, first in small pockets of early dairy farming communities, that kept the lactase enzyme switched on well into adulthood instead of shutting it off after childhood. Most humans in history never carried this mutation. A large share of humans alive today still don't, which is exactly why lactose intolerance remains the default setting for most adults on Earth, not the exception. Something close to 2/3 of the world's adult population still can't fully digest lactose. In parts of Northern Europe, the number flips almost completely, with the overwhelming majority able to drink milk without issue. In much of East Asia, tolerance drops to a small fraction of that. This didn't happen just once either. A geneticist named Sarah Tishkoff, studying cattle herding populations in East Africa, found that certain groups there evolved their own separate genetic mutation for adult lactose tolerance, completely independent of the one that spread through Europe. Different continent, different mutation, same underlying pressure. Wherever humans built a life around milking animals, evolution seemed to find its own way of catching up. A geneticist named Mark Thomas at University College London helped trace how this mutation spread by studying ancient DNA alongside the archaeological record of early farming societies moving across Europe. His research pointed to something counterintuitive. The ability to digest milk as an adult isn't some universal baseline trait humans have always had. It's a relatively recent evolutionary event, concentrated almost entirely in populations with a long, sustained history of dairy farming. And it very likely spread precisely because cheese and other fermented dairy products had already made milk worth consuming, lactose intolerance or not. The behavior came first. The biology adapted afterward, catching up to a habit that already existed. Think about what that quietly flips inside your own head. You probably grew up assuming milk is just food, plain and neutral, something every human body was always built to handle. For most of human history, and for a majority of people alive on Earth right now, that assumption simply isn't true. If your ancestors happened to come from a culture with a long dairying tradition, being able to drink a glass of milk without discomfort is something you can trace back to a specific genetic shift, not a universal human trait. If your ancestors didn't, your digestive system might still be running on the original factory setting shared by nearly every other mammal on the planet. Either way, cheese arrived first, doing the work your genes hadn't caught up to yet. There's another detail buried in Boguki's discovery that's easy to miss, and it says something about who this technology actually belonged to. That perforated pottery in Poland wasn't found near some grand ceremonial site or the residence of a ruling elite. It turned up in ordinary Neolithic settlements, sitting alongside everyday tools and butchered animal bones from regular households. This wasn't a delicacy reserved for the powerful. It was survival food for ordinary families trying to stretch a small herd of animals through a hard season. Why did that matter so much? Because cheese solved a second problem hiding behind the first one. Fresh milk spoils within hours in a world with no refrigeration. Cheese, especially once dried, salted, or aged, can last for weeks or even months. It turned a fragile, fast-decaying resource into something stable enough to store through winter. In a world where a bad season could mean starvation, that kind of stability wasn't a luxury. It was survival. From there, the idea simply kept traveling. Roman writers documented dozens of regional cheese-making methods across their empire, trading recipes the way modern cooks trade family recipes today. Medieval monasteries in Europe refined aging and rind techniques for centuries, mostly to preserve food through long winters. And many of those exact methods still define specific cheeses sold in stores right now. Every regional variation you've ever tasted, every soft cheese, hard cheese, blue-veined cheese, or smoked cheese, is really just a different answer to the same two ancient accidents. Different bacteria, different aging conditions, different climates shaping the final result. But underneath all of that variety sits the same basic chemistry a Neolithic herder in Poland stumbled into by accident, and the same solid mass a mourner in ancient Egypt once sealed away in a jar. So why does any of this matter to you now, grabbing a piece of string cheese out of a fridge or slicing something onto a cracker? Because almost nothing about that small casual moment is as simple as it looks, and it never was, even 7,000 years ago. You're not just eating a snack. You're eating the end result of a biological workaround your ancestors stumbled into before they had any concept of enzymes, bacteria, or genetics. You're holding proof that a body's rules can bend when the right accident meets the right amount of hunger and persistence. Every time fermentation shows up in your food, in your bread, your yogurt, your pickles, your favorite drink, you're looking at the same basic move repeating itself. Humans running into a biological wall, and instead of turning back, using invisible microscopic life to break straight through it. Cheese stands as one of the oldest confirmed examples on record, and possibly one of the most consequential, because the evidence increasingly suggests it didn't just feed people. It may have helped reshape the human genome itself, nudging entire populations toward a genetic trait that didn't exist before farming began. That's not an exaggeration for effect. That's what the archaeological chemistry and the ancient DNA record taken together increasingly point toward. It's worth asking what other habits sitting in your kitchen right now got there the same way. Not through careful planning, but through generations of ordinary people running into a wall and refusing to just accept it. Most of them left no names behind. No one wrote down who first noticed that a stomach pouch could turn milk solid, or who decided the resulting curds were worth eating rather than throwing out. That knowledge simply traveled, herder to herder. household to household, until it became so ordinary that nobody thought to ask where it came from anymore. You're the end point of that chain whether you ever think about it or not. There is still a piece of cheese sitting somewhere in your kitchen. Now you know it was never just a snack. It's a 10,000-year-old solution to a problem your own body used to have, and for a large part of the world, still does.